Everyone in this neighborhood had already decided who he was. The weak man. The quiet one. The guy you could insult, push aside, and forget 5 minutes later. They laughed when he walked past. They spoke over him. Some of them made it a game, how far they could go before he finally snapped. But he never did. He just lowered his head and kept walking, like a man who had already accepted his place at the bottom. What no one noticed was the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, or how his eyes never searched for help, only exits, or how his silence felt deliberate. Because fear doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like patience. The night they crossed the line, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't even look angry. He simply went home, locked the door, and sat alone in the dark. Then he reached into a drawer he hadn't opened in years and pulled out an old phone, one that didn't have a name attached to it. When the call connected, he said just one sentence. On the other end of the line, the laughter stopped. By morning, the neighborhood would feel different. By the end of the week, it would be quiet. And by the time the truth came out, everyone would understand why some men are dangerous, not because they fight back, but because they never have to. As you listen, think about this. When someone stays silent while the world pushes them down, is that weakness or strategy? If you enjoy stories like this, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you believe. And if you've already done that, then let's begin. The neighborhood had learned to move at a certain pace. Slow in the mornings, restless by afternoon, and uneasy after sunset. The streetlights flickered more than they should, casting long shadows that stretched across cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. People here knew each other's habits, their weaknesses, their routines. And they noticed everything. They noticed him too. He lived in a small apartment above a closed tailor shop, the kind of place most people passed without looking twice. Every morning, at almost the same time, he stepped outside, locked his door carefully, and walked down the street with his hands in his pockets. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his gaze fixed just ahead of his feet. He didn't rush. And he didn't linger. He simply moved, like someone who had learned that drawing attention, good or bad, was dangerous. To the people watching, he was easy to define. The weak man. The quiet one, the man who never caused trouble. Some of the shop owners smirked when he passed. A few younger men leaned against walls and laughed just loud enough for him to hear. Someone once bumped into him on purpose and didn't apologize. Another time, a voice followed him down the street, mocking the way he walked, the way he dressed, the way he never looked back. He never responded. Not with words, not with anger, not even with a glance. That, more than anything else, made people bold. At the corner cafe, where conversations were loud and respect was currency, he sat alone when he stopped for coffee. He always chose the same seat, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room without making it obvious. The waitress barely remembered his order, and the men at the next table spoke about him as if he wasn't there at all. "Does he ever talk?" one of them asked once, not bothering to lower his voice. Another laughed. "What's he gonna say?" The table erupted in quiet amusement. He stirred his coffee, steady and slow, as though the sound of the spoon mattered more than the words being thrown at him. People mistook that calm for emptiness. They didn't see how his eyes tracked movement automatically, how he noticed who entered the cafe and who left together. They didn't notice how his posture changed subtly when the door opened, or how he always paid in cash, exact change, no hesitation. Those details didn't fit the story they had already written about him. And stories, once agreed upon, are hard to change. At night, the neighborhood grew louder in different ways. Music leaked from open windows. Arguments echoed briefly and disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded into nothing. From his window, he watched the street below without being seen, the same way he always had. He knew which lights stayed on late and which doors closed early. He knew which corners were safe and which ones weren't. The people below still laughed. They laughed when he passed them on the stairs. They laughed when he didn't react. They laughed because they believed laughter was power, and silence was surrender. What they didn't understand was that some men learn very early that silence is not the absence of strength. It is the discipline of it. It is knowing when not to reveal yourself. It is choosing to endure the small things so larger ones never have to be fought in public. To the neighborhood, he was nothing more than a background figure. Another shadow among many. Another life that didn't matter enough to notice closely. And that was exactly how he had survived for as long as he had. In a place where everyone watched everyone else, the most dangerous thing you could be was underestimated. And for now, that was exactly what he was. By the time the day truly began, he had already blended into it. The building where he worked sat between louder places, offices where people spoke in confident tones and walked with purpose. His workplace was quieter, more forgettable, the kind of place people ended up rather than chose. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution, and the lights hummed softly overhead. It was a space designed for routine, not ambition. He arrived early, as he always did. Not because anyone asked him to, but because it allowed him to settle in before the noise arrived. He hung his jacket carefully, straightened his desk, and reviewed the day's tasks without complaint. When others filtered in, their presence filled the room quickly. Chairs scraping, voices overlapping, laughter sharp and careless. They noticed him then. Not with respect, but with familiarity. The kind that comes from knowing someone won't push back. The comments were never loud enough to justify a confrontation. Never direct enough to demand a response. A joke about how quiet he was. A remark about how he always followed instructions. Someone once asked, half laughing, if he even had a life outside of work. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, before someone else changed the subject. He kept working. When mistakes were made, they found their way to his desk. When something went missing, his name surfaced casually, as if by habit. He corrected errors that weren't his, rechecked numbers he hadn't entered, stayed late without being asked. Gratitude was rare. Mockery was not. There was a man in the office who seemed to enjoy it more than the others. He spoke louder when he was nearby, exaggerated his gestures, turned small moments into performances. Once, he leaned over his desk and said, with a grin that invited an audience, "You ever gonna stand up for yourself?" The room went quiet just long enough to notice. He looked up, calm, eyes steady. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something. Then he nodded slightly, returned to his work, and the moment passed. Laughter followed, relieved and dismissive, as if tension had been a game and the outcome already decided. That answer, or lack of one, satisfied them. People like explanations. And when they don't get them, they invent their own. To his co-workers, his silence became proof. Proof that he had nothing to say. Nothing to defend. Nothing worth listening to. But beneath the surface, there were things that didn't fit. He remembered details others forgot. Numbers, names, small inconsistencies in conversations. When a supervisor changed a story mid-sentence, he noticed. When tempers flared unexpectedly, he adjusted his distance without thinking. When voices rose, his breathing slowed instead of quickening. Once, during a minor disagreement that escalated too quickly, a chair was kicked back hard enough to slam into a wall. Everyone jumped. Everyone except him. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. His hand paused for half a second, then continued writing, steady as before. No one commented on that. At lunch, he ate alone. Always had. Not because no one invited him, though no one did, but because isolation had become another unspoken rule. Sitting by himself made him easier to categorize. Easier to dismiss. He seemed unaware of the conversations happening just out of reach, the laughter that occasionally drifted his way. In truth, he heard everything. He listened the way some people watched. Quietly. Completely. Not for gossip, but for patterns. Who spoke when authority entered the room. Who avoided eye contact during certain conversations. Who laughed the loudest when someone else was targeted. He never joined in. He never reacted. That restraint confused a few people, unsettled others, but most simply ignored it. They were too busy convincing themselves they were stronger, louder, more important. They mistook his calm for submission because submission was easier to understand than control. Near the end of the day, someone knocked over a stack of papers near his desk. It was careless, maybe intentional. No apology followed. He knelt down, gathered the pages, straightened them precisely, and placed them back where they belonged. His movements were efficient, practiced, almost ritualistic. There was something deliberate about the way he did even the smallest things. Not rushed, not sloppy, never careless. When the workday ended, others left in clusters, still talking, still laughing. He waited until the room thinned out, then shut down his computer and stood. For a brief moment, as he slipped on his jacket, his reflection caught in the darkened screen. His expression was unreadable. Not tired. Not angry. Just distant. To everyone else, he was exactly what they believed him to be. But beliefs are fragile things. And the calm he carried through those daily humiliations was not the calm of a man who had nothing left. It was the calm of someone who had learned, through long experience, that reacting too early was far more dangerous than waiting. For now, he let them laugh. For now, he let them believe. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had gathered without meaning to. It happened the way these things always did. Slowly at first, then all at once. A small crowd outside the corner shops, people lingering longer than usual, conversations overlapping as the evening air cooled. Someone had brought a speaker. Someone else leaned against a car with the engine still running. The street had become a stage, and no one questioned why. He was passing through when it began. He had just stepped off the curb when a voice called out his name, stretched thin with mockery. He stopped, not because he was startled, but because stopping had become instinct. Turning slowly, he faced the sound with the same unreadable calm he always carried. A few men stood together near the cafe entrance. Confident. Relaxed. The kind of confidence that grows when an audience is present. One of them stepped forward, smiling as though this were friendly, as though what came next wasn't already decided. "Hey," the man said, loud enough for others to hear. "You always in a hurry, or just scared?" Laughter rippled outward, spreading faster than the words themselves. Someone nudged another person. Phones shifted in hands, not quite raised, but ready. He didn't answer. That only encouraged them. Another man circled closer, close enough to invade his space, close enough to make the point clear. He smelled alcohol and cheap cologne. "You never say anything," the man continued. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." The laughter grew louder this time. It wasn't cruel yet. Not openly. It was playful, they told themselves. Harmless. That was how these things always justified themselves, by pretending they were jokes. Someone bumped into him from behind. Not hard. Just enough. A test. He stumbled forward a step, caught himself, and straightened. His hands remained at his sides. His face didn't change. He didn't look around for support, didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. He simply stood there, still and silent, while the noise swelled around him. "Careful," a voice called out. "Wouldn't want him to break." More laughter. The crowd had grown now. People who didn't know him. People who knew him only by reputation. By rumor. By the story everyone agreed on. The quiet man. The weak one. The man who wouldn't do anything. Someone clapped slowly, sarcastically. Another person mimicked his posture, hunching their shoulders and lowering their head. The mockery sharpened, finding its rhythm. Through it all, he remained unchanged. His breathing was steady. His eyes were open, alert, but distant. He listened, not to the insults themselves, but to the way they were delivered. The spacing between voices. The tone shifts. Who laughed too quickly, who hesitated. Who watched with discomfort and who leaned in with interest. He noticed everything. A hand reached out and tugged lightly at his jacket, pulling him back a step. It was casual. Almost lazy. But the message was clear. Still, he said nothing. To the crowd, that silence was confirmation. Proof that they were right. Proof that the roles they had assigned were accurate and final. The laughter turned louder, more careless. People felt safe now. Emboldened. Someone shouted, "Say something." The words echoed briefly, then dissolved into laughter again. He lowered his gaze. Not in shame, but in thought. A small movement, easily misunderstood. Easily celebrated. A few people nodded to one another, satisfied. This was what they had come for. The moment stretched longer than expected. An uncomfortable pause crept in, thin but noticeable. The laughter softened, uncertain of what to do next. The men closest to him exchanged looks. One of them scoffed, breaking the tension. "Figures," he said. "That's all he is." That was when it happened. Not something loud. Not something dramatic. Just a look. For half a second, his eyes lifted. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in clarity. A glance that passed over the faces in front of him, calm and measuring. The kind of look that didn't react to the present moment at all, but evaluated what it meant. Most people didn't notice it. But a few did. One man shifted uncomfortably. Another stopped laughing mid-breath. The pause was subtle, fleeting, easily dismissed. The noise returned almost immediately, swallowing the moment whole. He stepped back, creating space where there had been none. Adjusted his jacket. Smoothed the fabric once, carefully. The gesture was deliberate, controlled, almost ceremonial. Then he turned and walked away. The crowd let him go, satisfied with the ending they had expected. The laughter followed him for a few steps, then turned inward, feeding on itself. Stories were already being reshaped, retold louder than before. Did you see his face? He didn't even try. Some people are just born like that. He didn't look back. As he disappeared down the street, the noise behind him slowly faded, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood settling back into itself. The crowd dispersed, convinced they had witnessed exactly what they believed they would. They had seen a man pushed to the edge. They had seen him endure. What they hadn't seen was what endurance really meant. Because silence isn't always surrender. And what looks like weakness, when misunderstood long enough, becomes the most dangerous disguise of all. But silence can hide more than you think. Before this story goes any further, take a moment. If you've ever seen someone underestimated, if you've ever been judged by silence instead of strength, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because what comes next isn't about humiliation anymore, it's about consequences. The evening had a different edge this time. The streets that had always seemed predictable, where laughter and casual insults bounced off the walls like routine echoes, now carried a tension that felt heavier, almost deliberate. He walked with the same measured steps, jacket zipped just enough to feel contained, hands brushing lightly over the seams. But the quiet air around him was no longer ordinary. It shifted subtly, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. It began near the small grocery where his younger cousin sometimes helped after school. He noticed the subtle movements first, shadows stretching differently, a car parked just beyond the corner, engine humming softly but too long. There were faces he recognized from previous encounters, nodding to one another in ways that spoke more than words ever could. One figure stepped forward casually, lingering near the doorway, pretending to check a phone. Another leaned against a lamp post, posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and tracking. His cousin came out, cheerful as always, carrying a small basket. One of the men spoke first, voice loud enough for the young boy to hear. "Hey, look who's here. Didn't expect the family to show up." Laughter followed, low at first, then spreading as others joined in, sensing the moment was intentional. The man stepped closer, brushing past the cousin, bumping him deliberately. It was small, almost casual, but it carried weight. He didn't move at first. He didn't raise his voice. Not yet. He tilted his head, scanning each person with a practiced, almost clinical patience. He noticed how one of the taller men had shifted his weight repeatedly, a subtle tell, a nervous twitch in the hand that rested near his pocket. Another glanced toward the alley repeatedly, checking angles, assessing escape routes. The movements were too purposeful to be random, and they carried the same rhythm he had learned to recognize long ago. His past, long buried beneath years of quiet anonymity, stirred. Not memories of fear or regret, but of skill and precision, the kind that had once made him dangerous in ways no one in this neighborhood would ever guess. Quick calculations, tiny patterns in behavior, body language that betrayed intent, these things registered instinctively. He could see it all, measure the threat, understand its potential. The adrenaline that had once come at the wrong time now stayed tightly controlled, coursing beneath his calm exterior, ready but restrained. The men began to speak in lower tones, words just audible to him, intended to intimidate. The cousin laughed nervously, trying to mask unease. One of the men leaned down slightly, whispering something he didn't quite catch. He caught the motion, the micro-expression that betrayed tension behind the casual words. Another person shifted on the sidewalk, small but deliberate, positioning himself between the street and the building behind them. He remained still, observing. His breathing did not rise. He calculated. Small, seemingly meaningless details that others overlooked filled in a map only he could read. Which way an escape would be attempted. How many people could intervene before the situation escalated? Where the shadows fell, which corners offered cover, which alleyways could be advantageous? Each piece of information flowed into a pattern, forming an invisible strategy that no one else would perceive. And then his cousin's laugh faltered, as one of the men pushed slightly harder, brushing his shoulder, stepping closer, eyes locking with a predatory confidence. The crowd around them had sensed the shift, quieting just enough to notice tension, whispers replacing laughter. The air seemed to thicken, the hum of the nearby streetlights amplifying the unspoken stakes. A fleeting micro-flashback struck him, a memory of a different place, a different time, when similar threats had been made, and he had acted decisively, efficiently, without hesitation. The memory was sharp and clinical, the movements precise, the response immediate. He remembered how to read the smallest tells, how to anticipate danger, how to make it vanish before it ever truly became visible. Not through noise or intimidation, but through quiet, controlled mastery. He exhaled slowly, just enough for a subtle shift in posture. The crowd didn't notice the micro-adjustments, the tightening of his hand at his side, the minute alignment of his feet. The men assumed he was still the same quiet, harmless figure. They did not know the depth of awareness they had triggered, the years of instinct and precision lying dormant beneath that calm surface. The tension increased, subtle glances moving between the men, small gestures signaling impatience or uncertainty. One of them fumbled slightly with his keys, another tapped his phone repeatedly, trying to maintain a facade of casual indifference. He noted each tell, each micro-expression, cataloging their intentions, predicting their next movements. His mind moved faster than the perception of anyone around him. The cousin, oblivious to the calculations happening mere steps away, smiled again, attempting to smooth the tension. The smallest act, an innocent laugh or glance, could have tipped the balance, but he adjusted instantaneously. His presence alone, measured and precise, created an unseen boundary that even the aggressors felt without understanding why. By the time the men realized the conversation had yielded nothing, no visible fear, no retort, no submission, the subtle shift was already complete. His observations, his understanding of their rhythm, and the micro-flashbacks of his past had prepared him to act when necessary. For now, he waited, letting the tension hang, letting the threat fully expose itself. He finally moved, lightly guiding his cousin toward the door of the building, movements careful, deliberate, a protective shadow. The men watched, unaware that their small acts of intimidation had already been registered, mapped, and mentally neutralized. The street buzzed with whispers, neighbors speculating about what had just occurred, some feeling unease they could not explain. And as they disappeared into the relative safety of the doorway, his gaze lingered briefly on the group, calm but calculating, the smallest hint of something beneath the surface that no one could yet name. Every movement, every glance, every subtle cue had been logged, understood, and filed away. The streets were the same, the neighborhood unchanged to the casual observer, but the game had shifted in ways they could not see. For him, it was not fear that dictated his response. It was awareness, discipline, knowledge that what seemed harmless to others could become lethal when underestimated. And in the quiet of that evening, the subtle hum of the street, the whispers of the crowd, and the nervous adjustments of those who thought they had power all spoke the same truth. Some people are not weak. They are simply waiting. He returned to his apartment in near silence. The street behind him had returned to its usual rhythm: distant laughter, the low hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. But inside, the air felt different. He moved with purpose, not haste. Every step was measured, deliberate. Once inside, he closed the door, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. There were none. The hallway remained empty, just as it always had, and for a moment, the quiet settled around him like a shroud. He walked to the small wooden desk in the corner, the surface worn and scarred from years of use. A drawer clicked open. Inside lay a single, old phone. Its edges were chipped, the screen scratched and dull. It was not a phone one could use casually. It bore no name, no label, no digital footprint. Only one person in the world would answer if he called. He lifted the device, fingers brushing lightly over its surface. His reflection caught in the dark screen, eyes steady, composed, but alert. There was a pause, a quiet inhale that had nothing to do with nerves. It had to be precise. The number he dialed was etched into memory. Not in the way numbers are remembered, but as part of a rhythm, a pattern. The first ring sounded. Then the second. Third. When it was answered, a voice low and deliberate spoke. Recognition without greeting. Authority without question. He responded with a single line. Nothing more. A sentence weighted with meaning. And then the flashbacks began, brief but sharp, slicing through the present like shards of glass. A narrow alley, long ago. Shadows stretching across the walls. A man cornered, smiling falsely. Quick movement. A single strike. Silence. Control. Respect earned through fear. Another memory, a scar forming along his forearm. Pain ignored. A lesson learned. Reputation cemented in whispers. Names spoken quietly in fear. A table in a dimly lit room. Men around him. He did not speak. They did. They revealed everything with arrogance. One nod. One gesture. Decisions made. Orders followed without question. Back in his apartment, he felt the subtle tension of the present colliding with the echoes of the past. Every sound outside, every creak of the floorboards, was catalogued, measured. He was aware of proximity, of potential threat, but also of control. The call continued silently. Words were exchanged, but in short sentences, deliberate pauses. Every syllable carried weight. The person on the other end understood without explanation. They had shared the same past, known the same rules. Another memory surfaced. A night long ago. Rain-slick streets. A man running, desperate. Too slow. Lessons taught. Consequences delivered without spectacle. Fear instilled in the quietest of ways. He adjusted his grip on the phone, muscles tense, but movement minimal. Breath controlled. Mind sharp. Patterns assessed, outcomes calculated. The current threat, the bullies who had pushed his family, the neighborhood whispers, all pieces of a board he knew how to play. A subtle shift in posture, a micro-expression in the reflection of the screen. Even in these brief seconds, instinct guided him. The old phone had become a conduit, a link to a network that had never forgotten. Names, histories, debts owed, loyalty measured. All in motion with a single call. Flashback again, a quiet room, a man kneeling. eyes wide. One look and the choice was clear. Control had been absolute. No spectacle. Only authority, undeniable and immediate. Back to the present. The call ended. Silence returned, but it was different now. He did not put the phone down quickly. He held it for a moment, letting the weight of action settle, the knowledge that consequences had been set into motion. He traced a finger over the scratches in the screen, the scars in his hand, the faint reminders of his past. Nothing had changed in the apartment. Nothing had changed in the street outside. But the balance had shifted. The neighborhood had not noticed. The bullies, the mockers, the casual observers, they had no idea that forces they could not comprehend were already moving. Another flashback. A narrow hall, footsteps silent. Orders given with a glance. Decisions made before words could form. Fear, precision, respect, reputation. Short, sharp moments. All lessons learned in silence. He exhaled. Calm. Still. Composed. He placed the phone back in its drawer, the click echoing faintly in the quiet room. Everything now waited. Time moved differently when unseen mechanisms were in play. He had made a single move, and the consequences would unfold without him needing to intervene further. Even in the stillness, he felt the network of eyes, the awareness, the anticipation. A silent world of old rules, debts remembered, loyalties honored, and punishments delivered with efficiency. He stepped back from the desk. The apartment returned to the usual dimness, but he carried within him the invisible weight of preparation. Outside, the neighborhood carried on, ignorant of the quiet authority that had just been reactivated. And in that silence, the most important truth of all became clear. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Patient. Calculating. Invisible. Some lessons are taught quietly. Some warnings are delivered before anyone even knows to fear them. It started subtly. The first incident was a car, belonging to one of the men who had mocked him in the street, found overturned in the alley behind the corner shop. The tires were slashed. No witnesses were seen. No explanation was offered. People whispered quietly, glancing over their shoulders, but most dismissed it as misfortune or coincidence. Then came the shops. A small electronics store, owned by a man who had been present the night of the public humiliation, locked its doors in the middle of the day. The sign read, "Closed for inventory," though neighbors knew the closure was sudden, abrupt, unannounced. Hours passed. The owner did not appear. Some claimed illness, others shrugged it off, but the streets began to feel smaller, tighter, quieter. Rumors began to move faster than facts. Whispers in cafes, on stoops, in corners where voices had once been confident and loud. "Did you hear about Jero's car?" someone would ask, only to be hushed by another. The laughter that had once followed the quiet man was gone, replaced by tense glances and hesitant speech. A group of teenagers, emboldened by bravado the week before, found their skateboards missing, their bikes broken beyond repair, inexplicably vandalized though nothing had been witnessed. Their confusion turned to unease when they realized every one of them who had laughed at the quiet man had experienced some small misfortune, nothing overt, yet deliberate. At the cafe where he had once sat alone, the conversations had changed. Patrons murmured in hushed tones, eyes flicking toward the empty seat by the wall, remembering the man who never responded. No one could explain why, but a subtle dread lingered in the air. Even the barista who had once ignored him, now spoke quietly, almost reverently, when mentioning him in passing. The men who had been most vocal during the harassment began to notice the patterns. One after another, minor inconveniences escalated into larger, inexplicable consequences. Their businesses faced sudden inspections, mysterious fines appeared on papers they hadn't signed, and equipment failed without reason. A truck delivering supplies to a cafe simply would not start one morning. Another, owned by someone who had mocked him openly, found all his windows broken in a single night. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Just destruction, precise, intentional, and untraceable. Neighbors began to whisper in a new way. Their stories no longer carried amusement, but caution. Even those who had been casual observers now paused to look over their shoulders. The quiet man's presence in the neighborhood had been assumed harmless for so long that no one considered the possibility that the calm endurance they had mocked might be preparing something far greater. Children who once mimicked his posture in jest now avoided him, not out of respect, but because they felt, instinctively, that there was danger in underestimating him. Adults who had laughed, who had played with his patience as though it were a toy, now spoke in riddles, cautious of the eyes that might be watching, of the invisible hand moving silently through the streets. A man who had been particularly bold, leaning over the young cousin in the previous incident, smirking as he dared the quiet man to react, woke one morning to find his apartment flooded, a pipe that had appeared sturdy and secure leaking endlessly. Water destroyed furniture, personal items, and his sense of control. The cause was never found, the repairs expensive, the humiliation complete. He didn't speak of it to anyone, but the fear was evident. Another found his vehicle mysteriously towed, only to be informed it had been abandoned illegally in a distant location, far from where it had been parked. He tried to laugh it off, but the unease remained, settling into the small muscles in his neck and jaw that no one noticed until they tensed in quiet moments. Small gestures, small actions, accumulated into a pattern. People began to notice. Windows shuttered earlier than before. Conversations became cautious, stops in public places were briefer, smiles tighter, laughter sharper and wary. The entire neighborhood, once indifferent or amused, became alive with whispers. The sense of omnipresence was subtle but unmistakable. Something was moving in the background, something deliberate, precise, and impossible to confront directly. Even the streetlights seemed to feel different. The flicker that had been an ordinary nuisance now appeared almost sentient, casting longer shadows across corners where no one stood. People noticed patterns in the darkness, in the timing of the accidents, in the way misfortune seemed to select its victims almost methodically. And through it all, the quiet man remained unseen, blending into the streets with the same deliberate, unreadable calm he had carried from the beginning. The tension he had absorbed, the patterns he had memorized, the moments he had silently endured, all of it converged now in a way no one could predict. By the end of the week, it was no longer minor inconvenience. The neighborhood felt lighter when certain people were absent, the streets quieter where laughter had once echoed. Those who had pushed, mocked, and humiliated him now walked with eyes darting, shoulders tight, words measured. Even the bravest dared not act without a second thought. And yet, the man who had been underestimated remained exactly where he always had been, calm, still, a shadow among many, waiting for nothing, watching everything. The whispers reached a singular, chilling understanding. The people who had laughed at him had just made a fatal mistake. If you've been following this story, you've seen how the quietest ones can be the most dangerous. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Tell me, have you ever underestimated someone, and live to regret it? If you've already done that, then let's see what happens next. The neighborhood had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Doors remained closed longer, windows shuttered earlier. The usual hum of chatter and laughter had been replaced by low murmurs, cautious glances, and the occasional hurried footstep that carried more urgency than necessity. People moved differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if the very air had shifted and demanded careful navigation. Those who had once mocked him, who had laughed at his silence, were missing more often than not. Shops stayed shuttered, casual strolls were shorter, and even the boldest voices had grown hesitant. The streets whispered of absence without explanation. Names that had been repeated in jokes and ridicule were now spoken quietly, with concern, in corners where no one wanted to be overheard. The first to notice were the neighbors who had always kept watch. They saw men avoiding certain corners, skirting the familiar path, pausing mid-step to look over shoulders. Small cues, easily dismissed by outsiders, told them something had changed. Something precise. Something purposeful. Fear had entered the rhythm of the street, subtle but undeniable. A small cafe that had been a hub of casual gossip closed for a week without notice. Its owner had been one of those who had jeered openly at him, who had smiled too wide when the quiet man passed. Patrons assumed illness or routine maintenance, but those who observed the street closely noticed the absence, the silence that filled the doorway. Even the barista, usually brisk and cheerful, lingered in the shadows, eyes alert, as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. The bullies themselves became cautious in ways that spoke volumes. One man, bold and careless only days before, now walked with his hands in pockets, shoulders tense, scanning every street for signs of threat. Another, whose laughter had echoed loudly in previous incidents, avoided familiar corners, his eyes darting like a nervous animal. They had learned, quietly and without instruction, that the consequences were never random, that absence could be deliberate, and that the streets themselves carried a weight they could not name. Hints of something larger began to surface. Vehicles parked outside closed doors, black and unmarked, silently waiting. Figures observed from shadowed alleys, still and patient, measuring the neighborhood in ways that suggested authority. Doors opened to reveal no one, yet the subtle arrangement of objects, trash bins shifted, signage aligned differently, a newspaper folded and left conspicuously, spoke of surveillance and control. It was clear to those who feared it that they were not alone, and that those responsible operated beyond the understanding of ordinary people. At night, the absence of laughter carried heavier than any sound. Steps echoed in the alleys where men had once swaggered. Windows reflected unfamiliar silhouettes moving at deliberate pace, slow, precise. The neighborhood itself seemed to contract, the streets narrower, the familiar corners less forgiving. Whispers circulated, hints of he's involved, someone is watching, things aren't as simple as they seem. No one claimed to know more, but the unease spread faster than rumor ever could. One man, who had been particularly vocal and confident in the past, returned home one evening to find the door to his apartment ajar. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Yet he felt the weight of eyes that were not there, a presence that implied observation without confrontation. He did not speak of it to anyone, and he left the building quickly, avoiding familiar faces as if they, too, might reveal what he did not want to acknowledge. The effect was cumulative. Each incident, small on its own, created a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Vehicles disappeared, deliveries failed, unexpected inspections occurred. Yet no violence was overt. No one was harmed physically. Instead, intimidation worked in whispers, glances, and absence. It was the invisible hand of enforcement, precise and efficient. Each small misfortune carried a lesson, and each lesson reinforced a single unspoken truth. Disrespect came with consequences, and those consequences were always inescapable. The quiet man remained absent from the streets, yet he was everywhere in perception. His presence, invisible but undeniable, shaped behavior. People adjusted, recalculated, and restrained themselves without knowing why. They sensed, instinctively, that the pattern they were caught in was intentional, deliberate, and controlled by someone they had long underestimated. And the neighborhood, for the first time in memory, understood fear in its purest form, not loud, not violent, not chaotic, but methodical. It was the fear that comes from knowing that someone possesses the ability to act without revealing intent, to enforce without spectacle, and to control without confrontation. Even the youngest, those who had once mocked or mimicked him, altered their routes home, stayed closer to parents, and spoke less loudly. The adults, previously confident in their hierarchy, now whispered warnings, paused mid-sentence, and reconsidered choices that had once seemed trivial. It was as if the entire rhythm of daily life had been rewritten overnight, and no one could explain why. And through it all, the quiet man's legacy of patience and observation continued to work unseen. Every glance he had made, every detail he had catalogued, every slight endured, had culminated in a chain reaction the neighborhood could feel but could not trace. By the end of the week, it was clear to all who had watched and misjudged him, their laughter had been premature. Their confidence had been a mistake. The consequences were not random. They were deliberate, calculated, inescapable. The people who had laughed at him had just made a fatal mistake. The neighborhood had grown quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Doors remained closed longer, windows shuttered earlier. The usual hum of chatter and laughter had been replaced by low murmurs, cautious glances, and the occasional hurried footstep that carried more urgency than necessity. People moved differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if the very air had shifted and demanded careful navigation. Those who had once mocked him, who had laughed at his silence, were missing more often than not. Shops stayed shuttered, casual strolls were shorter, and even the boldest voices had grown hesitant. The streets whispered of absence without explanation. Names that had been repeated in jokes and ridicule were now spoken quietly, with concern, in corners where no one wanted to be overheard. The first to notice were the neighbors who had always kept watch. They saw men avoiding certain corners, skirting the familiar path, pausing mid-step to look over shoulders. Small cues, easily dismissed by outsiders, told them something had changed. Something precise. Something purposeful. Fear had entered the rhythm of the street, subtle but undeniable. A small cafe that had been a hub of casual gossip closed for a week without notice. Its owner had been one of those who had jeered openly at him, who had smiled too wide when the quiet man passed. Patrons assumed illness or routine maintenance, but those who observed the street closely noticed the absence, the silence that filled the doorway. Even the barista, usually brisk and cheerful, lingered in the shadows, eyes alert, as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. The bullies themselves became cautious in ways that spoke volumes. One man, bold and careless only days before, now walked with his hands in pockets, shoulders tense, scanning every street for signs of threat. Another, whose laughter had echoed loudly in previous incidents, avoided familiar corners, his eyes darting like a nervous animal. They had learned, quietly and without instruction, that the consequences were never random, that absence could be deliberate, and that the streets themselves carried a weight they could not name. Hints of something larger began to surface. Vehicles parked outside closed doors, black and unmarked, silently waiting. Figures observed from shadowed alleys, still and patient, measuring the neighborhood in ways that suggested authority. Doors opened to reveal no one, yet the subtle arrangement of objects, trash bins shifted, signage aligned differently, a newspaper folded and left conspicuously, spoke of surveillance and control. It was clear to those who feared it that they were not alone, and that those responsible operated beyond the understanding of ordinary people. At night, the absence of laughter carried heavier than any sound. Steps echoed in the alleys where men had once swaggered. Windows reflected unfamiliar silhouettes moving at deliberate pace, slow, precise. The neighborhood itself seemed to contract, the streets narrower, the familiar corners less forgiving. Whispers circulated, hints of he's involved, someone is watching, things aren't as simple as they seem. No one claimed to know more, but the unease spread faster than rumor ever could. One man, who had been particularly vocal and confident in the past, returned home one evening to find the door to his apartment ajar. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. Yet he felt the weight of eyes that were not there, a presence that implied observation without confrontation. He did not speak of it to anyone, and he left the building quickly, avoiding familiar faces as if they, too, might reveal what he did not want to acknowledge. The effect was cumulative. Each incident, small on its own, created a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Vehicles disappeared, deliveries failed, unexpected inspections occurred. Yet no violence was overt. No one was harmed physically. Instead, intimidation worked in whispers, glances, and absence. It was the invisible hand of enforcement, precise and efficient. Each small misfortune carried a lesson, and each lesson reinforced a single unspoken truth. Disrespect came with consequences, and those consequences were always inescapable. The quiet man remained absent from the streets, yet he was everywhere in perception. His presence, invisible but undeniable, shaped behavior. People adjusted, recalculated, and restrained themselves without knowing why. They sensed, instinctively, that the pattern they were caught in was intentional, deliberate, and controlled by someone they had long underestimated. And the neighborhood, for the first time in memory, understood fear in its purest form, not loud, not violent, not chaotic, but methodical. It was the fear that comes from knowing that someone possesses the ability to act without revealing intent, to enforce without spectacle, and to control without confrontation. Even the youngest, those who had once mocked or mimicked him, altered their routes home, stayed closer to parents, and spoke less loudly. The adults, previously confident in their hierarchy, now whispered warnings, paused mid-sentence, and reconsidered choices that had once seemed trivial. It was as if the entire rhythm of daily life had been rewritten overnight, and no one could explain why. And through it all, the quiet man's legacy of patience and observation continued to work unseen. Every glance he had made, every detail he had catalogued, every slight endured, had culminated in a chain reaction the neighborhood could feel but could not trace. By the end of the week, it was clear to all who had watched and misjudged him. Their laughter had been premature. Their confidence had been a mistake. The consequences were not random. They were deliberate, calculated, inescapable. The people who had laughed at him had just made a fatal mistake. The truth did not arrive loudly, it never needed to. By the time the neighborhood began to settle, by the time the fear had reshaped routines and silenced careless laughter, The quiet man finally returned to the places he had once walked unnoticed. He moved the same way he always had, measured, unhurried, eyes forward. But now, people noticed. Not because he demanded attention, but because they could not ignore him anymore. Those who crossed paths with him lowered their gaze. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A few offered forced smiles that vanished the moment he passed. No one confronted him. No one asked questions. The answers had already made themselves known. What they did not see were the years that had prepared him for this moment. There had been a time when silence was not a shield but a necessity. A time when speaking less meant surviving longer. In another life, far removed from these narrow streets and fragile routines, he had learned how power truly worked. Not through chaos. Not through noise. But through structure, loyalty, and consequence. Back then, he had been someone people feared instinctively. His name alone had altered plans. His presence had shifted rooms. He understood leverage, patience, and the quiet mathematics of influence. And when he walked away from that world, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried discipline with him, awareness, and an understanding that violence was never the first move, only the last. The neighborhood had mistaken his withdrawal for weakness. They mistook restraint for defeat. But restraint is not the absence of power, it is the control of it. In moments now remembered only in fragments, small truths surfaced. A scar glimpsed beneath a sleeve. A phone call ended abruptly when he entered a room. An old associate spotted briefly at the edge of the street, posture rigid with respect, eyes never meeting his. These were not accidents. They were echoes. Those who paid attention began to connect the dots too late. The men who vanished did not disappear randomly. Each had crossed a line. Each had ignored a warning they never realized they were receiving. And none of it required explanation. That was the most unsettling part. No threats were delivered. No messages sent. The consequences arrived already complete. The quiet man never celebrated. Never gloated. He simply resumed his place among the ordinary, now surrounded by an invisible boundary no one dared test. His loved ones were safe again. The tension that had once coiled tightly within him loosened, but it never disappeared. Men like him did not forget who they were. They only chose when to remember. What the neighborhood learned, what it would never forget, was that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it allows itself to be underestimated until the lesson becomes unavoidable. In the end, there was no confession. No revelation spoken aloud. Only understanding. They finally saw him for what he had always been. Not a victim, not a bystander, but a man who had chosen silence, until silence was no longer enough. And by then, it was already too late. The street had returned to its usual rhythm, though it no longer felt the same. The echoes of laughter that had once defined the neighborhood were gone, replaced by a careful, measured quiet. Windows remained shuttered, conversations were shorter, and glances lingered longer than necessary. People moved through the streets like shadows of themselves, aware of the invisible weight that had settled over their lives. And yet, the quiet man was gone from view, blending seamlessly into the ordinary. But the presence he left behind was undeniable. The ripple of his actions continued to shape the streets, guiding behavior without a single word, without a single show of force. Those who had once mocked him now walked cautiously, their bravado stripped away, replaced by an instinctive understanding that underestimation carries consequences. The story of this neighborhood, the lessons learned in whispers and absence, would linger. And it was not the last story of its kind. Elsewhere, shadows moved silently, networks of loyalty and fear extending into unseen corners, where power was measured not in violence, but in patience, perception, and the careful orchestration of consequences. For every neighborhood that thought itself safe, for every individual who assumed they had the upper hand, there is a lesson waiting to unfold. If you followed this story, you've witnessed how quiet endurance can be more powerful than the loudest intimidation, how underestimation can be the deadliest mistake. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones are not as they seem, where underestimation carries its own consequences, and where patience, observation, and hidden power change everything. Because in these streets, in these shadows, the next story is always waiting. And when it arrives, you'll want to be ready.